Something has changed, and the first card makes that impossible to ignore. Temperance is not a promise about the future. Think of it as a psychological mirror. Balance, restraint, integration, the ability to hold opposing forces without letting everything spill over. And that matters here because the group surrounding this person appears to have lost exactly that. From the outside, they may have looked united. Maybe they acted like choosing each other over you was obvious, justified, even necessary. But underneath that surface, too many competing emotions were being forced into the same container. Jealousy, ego, resentment, unspoken competition, people trying to keep the peace while secretly keeping score. Temperance asks what happens when balance is only being performed instead of genuinely created. And this is where the cracks begin. The person who chose this group may be realizing that what they called peace was actually avoidance. What they called loyalty may have been pressure to agree. What they called moving on may have been an attempt to silence uncomfortable feelings about you. Now, the emotional mixture is separating. One person says too much, another takes it personally. Someone feels exposed. Someone else starts questioning who's really telling the truth. And suddenly, the people who once seemed completely aligned cannot even agree on what happened. But the deepest part of temperance is not the conflict, it is the contrast. Because while this group struggles to regulate itself, your absence becomes louder. They may start remembering the steadiness you brought into situations they once blamed you for disrupting. They may begin seeing that your boundaries were not hostility, your questions were not attacks, and your refusal to play along was not the problem they made it out to be. And there is one realization beginning to form beneath all of this. It is not simply that they chose the wrong people. It is that they may have sacrificed the one connection that actually asked them to become more honest with themselves. And when that realization lands, the collapse gets much more personal. That is where regret becomes impossible to hide. And the Six of Wands reversed makes that even harder to dismiss. Upright, this card can reflect recognition, approval, the feeling of being supported by the people around you. Reversed, it asks a more uncomfortable question. What happens when that approval starts disappearing? Because without you there to point toward, the group has to look somewhere else. And increasingly, that means at each other. Someone who once felt completely validated may notice that the same people who encouraged their frustration with you are suddenly criticizing them. Someone else may realize that certain private conversations were never as private as they assumed. Old comments resurface. Stories change depending on who is telling them. And little inconsistencies that were easy to ignore when everyone had a common position against you start becoming much harder to explain. This is where the structure changes. Because a group can appear extremely close when everyone is reinforcing the same conclusion. But agreement is not always intimacy. Sometimes it is simply convenience. Sometimes people feel connected because they are standing against the same person, not because they actually trust one another. Remove that person, and eventually they have to discover what is underneath, and they may not like what they find. The Six of Wands reversed can symbolize that loss of collective validation. Somebody no longer feels admired, somebody feels overlooked. Another person may be wondering why they sacrificed so much loyalty to people who now seem strangely comfortable turning that same judgment toward them. That is when resentment starts traveling. The complaint that used to be about you becomes a complaint about someone else. The person who used to defend the group starts questioning it. Someone remembers being pressured to take a side before they actually understood what happened. And slowly, a different question enters the room. What if you were never the reason everyone was uncomfortable? What if your presence simply gave them somewhere to place discomfort that already existed? That possibility changes everything, because now they cannot restore the old balance by blaming you again. You are not there participating in the cycle. The tension remains anyway, and for at least one person, that may be creating a very specific problem. They are beginning to remember something they were told about you, a detail, a conversation, maybe an accusation they accepted because everyone else seemed so certain. But looking back now, one part of that story does not fit. And once they start questioning that one piece, they may realize they have to question who gave them the story in the first place. And the Seven of Swords brings that question into sharper focus. Not because this card automatically means someone lied. Psychologically, it can point to selective truth, avoidance, information moving indirectly, people acting without saying exactly what they are doing. And in a situation like this, that matters, because someone may be realizing they never actually had the full story. They had pieces, a comment repeated by one person, an interpretation added by another, a conversation summarized after the fact. Maybe something you supposedly said was accepted as truth, even though the person defending that version never heard it directly from you. At the time, nobody questioned it. Why would they? Everyone around them seemed to agree, but agreement can become its own kind of evidence when people want certainty badly enough. One person repeats something. Another confirms the emotion behind it. Someone else adds what they believe your intention must have been. Eventually, nobody remembers where the original information ended and the interpretation began. The Seven of Swords asks them to look at that gap, and now they may be looking. Someone remembers that you tried to explain yourself but were interrupted. Someone else realizes they were warned not to speak to you directly because you would supposedly twist things. Another person may start wondering why hearing your side was treated as disloyalty in the first place. That question creates another one. Who benefited from keeping everyone separated? Who needed the group to remain certain? Who became uncomfortable whenever somebody showed even a little sympathy toward you? This does not necessarily mean one mastermind created everything. Group dynamics can become distorted without anyone fully controlling them. But once people start protecting a shared narrative, they can also start protecting their own role in it. And that is where embarrassment enters, because the person who chose this group may now be seeing contradictions they cannot easily dismiss. Yet, admitting that means admitting something else too. They defended this, maybe strongly. They justified the distance. They repeated things they believed. They may have rejected opportunities to hear you because doing so would have required questioning people they trusted. So now the problem is no longer just truth, it is pride. Because seeing the contradiction privately is one thing, admitting they chose based on it is another. And somebody is getting very close to the point where they will have to decide which matters more. Protecting the version of themselves that was certain before, or admitting what they can already see now. And the world makes that choice much harder to avoid. Psychologically, this card can represent completion, perspective, the moment when separate pieces finally form one picture. not necessarily a happy ending. Sometimes completion simply means you can no longer pretend you do not understand what happened. And this person may be reaching that point. Things they criticized about you begin looking different now. A boundary they once called stubborn may look more like self-respect. A question they treated as unnecessary may have been the question everyone else was avoiding. Even certain warnings they dismissed could start sounding less dramatic when the same patterns begin happening directly in front of them. That creates an uncomfortable contrast. The group may have offered belonging, agreement, validation, the relief of not having to question anything too deeply. But what does that belonging feel like now? Confusion, suspicion, emotional exhaustion, maybe even loneliness while surrounded by people who are technically still there. And meanwhile, the connection they walked away from starts taking on a different meaning. Not because they are suddenly idealizing you or forgetting every difficult moment. The world is more useful than that. It asks them to see the whole picture, including their own participation in it, and that may be the part they resisted longest. Because nobody physically forced them to choose. They may have been influenced, pressured, encouraged. They may have been afraid of losing approval or becoming the next person the group questioned. But eventually, they still made a decision. And once they recognize that, they cannot place all of the responsibility somewhere else. That is where regret becomes heavier. It is easier to say, "They misled me," than to admit, "I wanted what they were telling me to be true." It is easier to blame the group than to acknowledge that accepting their version may have protected this person from confronting their own fear, insecurity, or responsibility toward you. The world can mark the end of that avoidance, and something changes when a person reaches the end of a story they spent so much energy defending. They stop defending it, maybe not publicly yet, but emotionally they begin pulling back. They stop explaining everyone's behavior. They stop smoothing over every contradiction. They stop automatically taking the group's side whenever tension appears, and the people around them notice. Because the person who once helped hold this entire structure together is no longer putting the same energy into keeping it standing. And now the group has a new problem. Your absence is not the only thing destabilizing them anymore. Their strongest defender may be becoming their first real dissenter. And the Four of Wands shows why that shift affects everyone else so quickly. Psychologically, this card can represent belonging, stability, the structure that makes people feel secure with one another. But stability depends on participation. A group can look solid because everyone keeps agreeing to play the same role. Once one person stops, the atmosphere changes. Messages get shorter. Reassurance that used to come automatically does not arrive. A joke that would have been laughed off suddenly feels pointed. Someone asks a simple question and another person becomes defensive because nobody is quite sure anymore what that question really means. The structure is still standing, but people no longer feel as safe inside it. And this is where hidden alliances start becoming easier to see. Maybe two people were never genuinely close. They simply shared the same position about you. Maybe someone who appeared supportive was quietly competing for influence the entire time. Maybe another person depended on this central figure to keep validating their behavior, because without that validation, they have to start questioning themselves. That is why this person's withdrawal can create resentment. Not everyone wants them to reconsider what happened, because if they admit you were treated unfairly, Other people may have to ask what role they played. Who repeated something without checking it? Who encouraged the separation? Who stayed silent because challenging the group would have been inconvenient? Suddenly, regret becomes threatening, so someone may push harder. They may insist the past happened exactly as everyone originally said. They may bring up old complaints again. They may provoke a disagreement just to see whose side this person takes. What looks like confidence can actually be an attempt to restore the old arrangement. And notice the contrast with Temperance. At the beginning, harmony was being performed. Now, maintaining that performance requires more pressure, more reassurance, more explanations, more reminders about who supposedly did what. More subtle demands that everyone remain loyal to the same version of events. That is not stability, that is maintenance. And the Four of Wands asks what happens when the person everyone expected to help maintain it stops cooperating, because eventually someone may confront them. Not necessarily with a dramatic ultimatum, it could be much quieter than that. A comment, a test, a moment where neutrality is suddenly treated like betrayal, and once again, this person is being asked to choose. Only this time, they know what choosing without asking questions cost them the first time. And the Page of Cups reversed shows what makes this second choice feel so different. Psychologically, this card can point to emotional immaturity, sensitivity that becomes defensiveness, feelings that are real but poorly expressed. And that matters because this time the person may actually notice what happens when they do not immediately agree. The mood changes. Maybe someone becomes cold. Maybe a simple question is treated like an accusation. Maybe the person says, "I'm not sure that's what happened." And suddenly they are being asked why they are defending you. That reaction tells them something, because they have seen it before. The pressure is not necessarily loud. It can come through disappointment, silence, a change in tone, someone acting hurt because this person wants more information before taking a side. And slowly, the original situation begins looking different. They may remember how quickly you were expected to accept someone else's version, how questioning one detail became proof that you were difficult, how refusing to agree with the group was interpreted as hostility rather than independent judgment. At the time, they may have believed you were creating tension. Now they are beginning to understand that you may have been responding to it. That is the reversal. Because the very quality they once criticised in you, the refusal to accept something simply because everyone else accepted it, may have been exactly what threatened the structure. You kept asking questions. You noticed contradictions. You did not automatically treat group agreement as proof. And when a system depends on everybody reinforcing the same interpretation, one person thinking independently can feel disruptive even when they are simply being honest. Now this person is becoming that person. They hesitate. They ask for context. They stop offering automatic reassurance. And suddenly the emotional consequences begin appearing around them too. The Page of Cups reversed can reflect what happens when uncomfortable feelings are handled through guilt instead of conversation. Someone may withdraw affection. Someone else may act offended. Another person may imply that questioning the group means choosing against it, and that is when the parallel becomes difficult to ignore, because this person may finally recognize the position you were placed in, not intellectually, emotionally. They are feeling the pressure themselves, and once that recognition lands, regret changes again. It is no longer only, maybe I chose wrong. It becomes something much harder to sit with. They are doing to me what we did to you. And after that, they cannot honestly say they do not understand anymore. And the Four of Cups brings in the emotional cost of understanding all of this too late. Psychologically, this card can reflect withdrawal, dissatisfaction, emotional distance, the moment when someone finally looks at what they ignored because they were too focused on what they thought they wanted. And that may be exactly where this person is now. Because experiencing the same pressure changes how they remember you. Your silence may no longer look cold, it may look tired. Your distance may no longer seem like punishment. It may look like the point where you realized that explaining yourself again was not going to change anything. Even moments they once described as you overreacting may start looking different when they understand how much pressure had already built before you responded. That does not mean every choice you made was perfect. It means the picture is becoming more honest, and honesty creates a different kind of regret. Because missing someone and understanding what you put them through are not the same thing. Missing you is about what they lost. Understanding you is about what they participated in. That distinction matters. A person can miss your presence because life feels emptier without it. They can miss the conversations, the familiarity, the stability, the way you showed up. But accountability begins when they stop asking only, "Why are you gone?" and start asking, "What made leaving feel necessary?" The Four of Cups sits directly inside that realization. Something valuable may have been available to them, but they could not recognize it clearly because their attention was somewhere else. Approval, group belonging, being right, avoiding conflict with people whose opinions felt important at the time. Now those things may not feel nearly as valuable, and this is where the emotion can become private. Not everyone in this group has to be sitting together crying. It may be much quieter than that. Anger turns into embarrassment. Certainty turns into doubt. Defensiveness becomes grief when someone realizes they cannot undo a choice simply because they finally understand it. And for this person, that may be the hardest part. They may want to explain now. They may want to acknowledge what they refused to acknowledge before. But understanding you does not automatically restore access to you. So the question becomes much more personal. What happens when someone finally knows what they should have said, finally understands what they should have protected, and finally wants to repair the connection, but they no longer know whether the person they hurt is still emotionally available to hear it? And the Knight of Pentacles reversed shows why that uncertainty may be affecting them more than they expected. Psychologically, this card can point to stagnation, repetition, effort being invested in something that is no longer moving anywhere. And that creates an important contrast here. Because while this group may still be circling the same arguments, you may not be. They could still be discussing what happened, replaying old conversations, defending choices that were made months ago, trying to decide who was right, who started what, who should apologize first. Meanwhile, you may have stopped needing the argument to end in your favor. That changes the balance. Because this person may have assumed that whenever they were finally ready to understand, you would still be standing in the same emotional place, waiting for them to arrive. But people do not always stay where they were left. You may have processed things they are only beginning to confront. You may have stopped rehearsing explanations for people who were committed to misunderstanding them. You may no longer need this person to admit what happened before you can trust your own experience of it. And that can be difficult for them to recognize. Not because you are punishing them, because the old dynamic required you to remain emotionally available to it, angry enough to respond, hurt enough to explain, invested enough to keep trying. The Knight of Pentacles reversed can symbolize what happens when someone expects a situation to remain fixed simply because they have not changed themselves. But your silence may no longer mean waiting, it may mean movement. And now the person who chose the group has to confront another possibility. The greatest consequence was not one dramatic moment when they lost you. It was all the time afterward when you kept growing and they kept repeating the same pattern. That is why regret can intensify now. The door they assumed would always be there may feel different, and people notice when access changes. Someone may start asking about you indirectly, checking what you are doing through another person, bringing your name into a conversation just to see how everyone reacts. Maybe even considering a message that says very little on the surface, but is really testing one thing. Are you still reachable? Because once they sense that you are no longer emotionally waiting inside the old story, curiosity can turn into urgency. And that is when the question stops being whether they miss you. It becomes why they suddenly need to know if the door is still open. And the Eight of Cups reversed makes that distinction even more important. Psychologically, this card can point to difficulty walking away, returning to something unfinished, or realizing that leaving a situation did not resolve what was happening underneath it. And that may be why the idea of reaching back toward you is becoming stronger. But wanting access again is not the same as taking accountability. Someone can miss you because the group no longer feels safe. They can regret the choice because the consequences are uncomfortable. They can look back toward you simply because what they chose instead is falling apart. That does not automatically mean they understand. The real question is what happens if they actually approach you? Can they name their own decisions without immediately saying who influenced them? Can they hear that you were hurt without turning your boundaries into another accusation against you? Can they accept that you may need distance without deciding that your distance proves you never cared? Those differences matter. Because reaching toward you and running away from the group can look almost identical at first. The Eight of Cups reversed asks what someone is really returning for. Relief? Familiarity? Forgiveness before they have fully faced what happened? Or are they finally prepared to confront the part of themselves that made the original choice possible? That is where this becomes much deeper than a reunion. Choosing you now would mean very little if they still need everyone else to approve of that choice. If the group pressures them again, do they fold? If someone rewrites the story again, do they stay silent? If being honest costs them belonging, can they tolerate that cost? Because courage matters most when there is something to lose. And this group may be discovering that removing you never created the peace they expected. The arguments remained. The insecurity remained. The competition remained. Only now there is no longer one person available to carry all of it. That is the real collapse, not simply people separating. The story they built around you is collapsing. The belief that everything would become easier once you were gone is becoming harder to defend because the same problems kept showing up after your exit. And that realization can overwhelm people, not because suffering proves anything, because eventually they have to face the possibility that you were never the source of what they were trying to escape. Which brings this to the final truth. It is not really about whether they come back. It is about what everything falling apart without you finally reveals about why you had to leave in the first place. And the Knight of Wands brings that final point into focus. Psychologically, this card can represent movement, conviction, the willingness to act once something can no longer be ignored. But movement is not the same as impulsiveness. Sometimes the most important movement is simply refusing to stay inside a pattern that keeps asking you to abandon your own judgment. And that may be what your leaving represented. Not perfection, not victory, a limit. Because balance was never supposed to mean absorbing everyone else's discomfort so the group could keep functioning exactly as it was. Temperance did not ask you to disappear inside the mixture. It asked for honesty between opposing forces, and if honesty kept being punished, questioned, or reframed as disloyalty, then eventually maintaining peace would have required you to betray your own perception of what was happening. That is not balance, it is self-erasure. The Knight of Wands changes the emphasis because it suggests movement away from that false arrangement. You may have been the person willing to interrupt something everyone else was invested in preserving. And now they are discovering what was actually being preserved. Avoidance, unspoken resentment, dependence on approval, a version of loyalty that worked only when nobody asked difficult questions. So when we say they chose wrong, it does not have to mean every person in this group was malicious or that you handled every moment perfectly. It means they may have chosen comfort over clarity. They chose the version of events that required the least self-examination. They chose temporary agreement over a connection that was asking for something harder, growth, and eventually, everything they suppressed still had to surface. That is why the tears matter less as spectacle and more as consequence. People become overwhelmed when certainty collapses, when the story they used to justify a decision no longer protects them from what they know. And maybe that is the final shift here. You do not need their regret to prove what you experienced. You do not need the group to collapse completely before your boundaries become valid. Their realization may confirm something, but it does not create your value. That existed before they recognized it, before they defended the wrong story, before they started questioning it, before anyone came back. And maybe that is what all of this was moving toward from the beginning. The truth did not need you to force it into the room. Once the false balance stopped holding, it revealed itself.